So we're going to start with the origins of dress. One of the best examples of dress from early periods are beads. And some of the oldest beads found so far are those from the Sickle Cave in Israel on Mount Carmel. They were made of shells and have been dated to 108,000 BCE. So BCE stands for before the Common Era or before the current era, and it's essentially the same thing as when someone says before Christ. Other examples from 36,000 to 28,000 BCE show beads strung on a cord with animal sinew, which were probably worn on garments or as head coverings. Post-Ice Age, which would be the Upper Paleolithic period, which was approximately 35,000 to 1,200 years ago, humans were depicted in sculpture or statuettes from bone, horn, or antler, or painted art in caves and rocks. Many of these examples depict people that are unclothed, but some appear to be wearing elements of dress. So the next slide shows an image of hairnets, cap-like headgear, string skirts, and bands around and below the breast and around the back to be visible. Archaeologists have concluded that the headgear was generally spirally handwoven, kind of like a basket. So we're talking about right here. And then skirts were made with stringing or tying cords from twisted plant fibers. So this is the Venus of Willendorf statuette, and appears to be wearing the headgear or some sort of hair netting. And it's dated to circa 24,000 to 22,000 BCE and was found in Austria in 1908. So the oldest actual textile fiber discovered by archaeologists dates back to about 30,000 years ago. They were made of flax fibers. Flax is the fiber that makes up the fabric linen, and they were discovered in a cave in Georgia, which is a country between Europe and Asia. The fibers were spun into some sort of yarn, maybe used for cording, clothing, or baskets, and then they were dyed in a color range from yellow, red, blue, violet, black, brown, green, and khaki. Sandals and slip-on shoes have been found from circa 8300 BCE. And the wearing of shoes is definitely older than the oldest shoes that have actually been found. Based on visual and artifact evidence, humans likely wore a dress made from fur, skins, and fibrous materials held together in some type of textile construction. So if any of you are fans of the TV show Naked and Afraid, that's kind of just what I picture in my head. So here is an example of leather slip-on shoes. They're kind of a moccasin style, and they were discovered in the Arnold Research Cave in central Missouri. So it has leather uppers, and then the inside was lined with grass. So there are places in the world where clothing isn't essential for survival, and yet most cultures use some form of dress. So if you've ever taken a psych or sociology class, you will probably have discussed the 4 basic motivations for wearing clothes, which include decoration, protection, modesty, and status. And of these, decoration is generally acknowledged to be primary. So think about why you wear clothes. Is it for decoration? Is it for protection, modesty, or status? Or maybe a combination of these things. Most cultures use dress to denote status, but this function probably became attached to dress after clothing first came into use. So what constitutes modesty differs from society to society. So think about what we might consider modest versus what, say, like an Amish person might consider to be modest. It's probably very different. What's considered to be modest here might be different from what is considered to be modest in a country like Brazil or in a country like Afghanistan. Protection from the elements is needed, it would seem, for survival, but humans seem to have had their origins in warm, not necessarily cold climates. Shelter and fire also provide warmth, and people from various geographic areas have differing responses to temperature of their surroundings. Another type of protection may be related to the origins and functions of dress, supernatural protection, or protection against spiritual dangers that are thought to surround each individual. People have worn good luck amulets and charms in different cultures. Aprons used to protect genitals from physical harm and from witchcraft may have evolved into skirts or loincloths, which we'll talk about later. Decoration of the human body is universal. So There are cultures in which clothing doesn't exist, but there are no cultures in which some form of decoration doesn't exist. So even if the culture doesn't wear clothing, they do still adorn themselves in other ways, like with paint, tattoos, hairstyles, piercings, and things like that. The logical conclusion is that decoration of the self is a basic human practice. The design of clothing is subject to limitations. Some garments are functional, so think like a raincoat keeps you dry or a puffer jacket keeps you warm. Those would be considered functional things. Except for costumes that have only a ceremonial purpose, the wearer must be able to move, to carry the weight of the garment, and to sometimes perform certain duties while wearing the clothing. So the duties assigned to an individual have a direct influence on the kind of dress they can wear. So think about if you go out to dinner at a nice restaurant, you are dressed nicely, whereas the wait staff is dressed in clothing that is more appropriate to the laborers they perform. So they're probably wearing black pants, an apron, non-slip shoes, things like that. Early humans may have also used animal skins. The draping qualities of skins are different from that of cloth and would impose certain restrictions on the shapes of garments that would be constructed. Once people learned to spin yarns and weave fabrics, they employed these techniques into clothing making. So we started manufacturing fibers in the 20th century, but prior to this, only natural materials were available for use. Each had their own inherent qualities and characteristics. For example, bark cloth, which was made from the inner layer of the bark of trees, was really stiff, but cotton, wool, and linen were a lot more flexible. So whatever region people were in, they were limited to the use of whatever local materials were there. So trade between regions brought materials from one place to another. Silk was little known in Europe until the Romans imported it from India and China. Cotton doesn't grow in the cooler northern climate of Europe, so that wasn't available until after the Crusaders imported limited quantities from the Near East, and then cotton cloth was known in medieval Europe. Dress is generally constructed by either draping or tailoring. So draped dress is created by the arrangement around the body of pieces of fabric that are folded, pleated, pinned, or belted in different ways. Draped clothing usually fits the body loosely and were probably developed after people learned to weave cloth. The use of skins or leather likely led to the development of tailored dress. In tailored garments, pieces are cut and sewn together, so they fit the body more closely and provide greater warmth than draped garments do, and they're more likely to be worn in cooler climates. Draped garments are more characteristic of warm climates. Some costume combines elements of both. Technology has had an important impact on dress. Think about how the changes that came about in Europe and North America after the 18th century come from the developments of mechanized spinning and weaving, the sewing machine, and the start of American ready-to-wear. Mass production helped simplify styles and speed up fashion changes. So a theme is a recurring or unifying subject or idea. We can identify many themes related to dress. So here I'm just going to touch on some of the themes that can help us approach the study of dress, which may facilitate the comparison of historical periods and aid in understanding how and why styles developed and changed. Throughout history, clothing has served many social purposes. So it's been used to differentiate between the sexes and to designate age, as well as occupational, marital, and socioeconomic status, group membership, and other social roles. So some of the things you'll hear are designation of gender differences. So one of the most fundamental aspects of dress in most societies is that custom decrees that the dress of men and women be different. And these differences reflect culturally determined views of the social roles appropriate to each sex. So no universal customs exist that dictate the specific forms of dress for each gender. What is considered appropriate may differ from one civilization or one century to another. For example, from the late Middle Ages until the 20th century in Western Europe, skirted garments, with a few exceptions like kilts, were designated as feminine, and trousers were designated more for male dress. Designation of age. Sometimes clothing serves to mark age-associated changes. Example, in Western Europe and in European settlements in North America, boys and girls often were dressed alike in their earliest years, and then once they reached a designated age, a distinction was made. So during the Renaissance in England, this was called breeching, when a 5 or 6 year old boy was given his first pair of breeches. Designation of status. A uniform or particular style of dress often designates occupational status. So think about firefighters, postal workers, police officers, and some of the clergy. Sometimes a uniform serves as a practical function, like a firefighter's waterproof coat and protective helmet, or a construction worker's hard hat. Think about also marital status. What does a wedding ring designate? Among the Amish, married men wear beards and unmarried men don't. Identification of group membership. So dress is also used to identify an individual as belonging to a particular social group. So a uniform or insignia may be adopted formally by that group and kept for its members alone, like fraternal groups like the Masons or Shriners, or religious groups like the Amish. Ceremonial use of clothing. Ceremonies are an important part of the structure of most societies and social groups. Designated forms of dress are frequently an important part of any ceremony. So think about weddings, baptisms, burials, mourning, even graduation. And then enhancements of sexual attractiveness. So clothing is also a means of enhancing sexual attractiveness. In some cultures, this is quite explicit, like clothing focusing on cleavage. In many periods, women have padded dresses to make their chest appear larger, or have worn dresses with lower necklines. At other times, the waist, hips, or legs have been emphasized. The last thing I'm going to discuss are some common things in costume history across time. So clothing as a means of social communication. If you think about it, dress is basically like a silent language. It tells the observer something about the organization of the society in which it's worn. It discloses the social stratification. For example, the political leaders in the African Ashanti tribe once wore a distinctive dress marking their special status. Any subject who wore the same fabric pattern as the king was put to death. In contrast, the costume of American political leaders doesn't differ that much from other people in society. The historical context. So there are some common themes in history, including politics referring to the government, conflict, which often is the cause of wars, economic events like trade, production and acquisition of textiles and apparel, like getting raw materials, and media of communication. You can read more about this in your textbook. If we look at cross-cultural influences throughout the history of Western dress, influences from other parts of the world have appeared. So when explorers, traders, soldiers, tourists, and immigrants visited regions new to them, the local practices contrasted with those of their own cultures. Looking at geography, environment, and ecology, factors such as geographic location, the natural environment, ecology, the relationship of humans to their physical environment, may emerge as themes that are evident in dress. Examples can be seen in preferences for tailored clothing in cold climates and draped clothing in warmer environments. Another example would be someone who avoids wearing leather or fur to protect endangered species, or because they care about animal rights. Clothing as an art form. Expression through arts is rooted in a particular culture and historical period. Conventions or customs determined the form and content of art in any given period. Although the human impulse toward expressed feelings through art is universal, the specific expression of an era is determined by a complex mixture of social, psychological, and aesthetic factors, which is often called the zeitgeist, or a spirit of the times. And then lastly, the phenomenon of fashion in Western dress. So the word fashion is often used interchangeably with the words costume, dress, and clothing. Fashion is more precisely defined as a taste shared by many for a short period of time. Fashion is not limited to clothing. It can also be observed in cars, houses, furniture, literary styles, and vacation destinations.